Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Whether you've had a long day or simply enjoy drifting off to history, tonight's journey is for you. Imagine a city that shouldn't have survived. Built on a narrow peninsula between two seas, surrounded by enemies, far from the heart of power. And yet, for more than 1,000 years, Constantinople stood. While Western Europe stumbled through the Dark Ages, this single city preserved the knowledge of Rome, built architectural wonders that still defy understanding, and quietly ruled the crossroads of the world. This is the story of Byzantium, the empire history forgot, and the golden city that was its heart. Tonight, we'll walk through Constantinople before its fall. We'll discover how Constantine chose this impossible location, how engineers built churches that seemed to float, and how a civilization preserved everything Rome had created while inventing something entirely new. We'll witness 1,000 years of quiet brilliance, ending in one of history's most tragic sunsets. Before we begin, if these stories help you unwind, consider subscribing. It helps others find their way here too. Now, let's step into Constantinople in the spring of 330 AD and watch as history changes direction. How does an emperor choose where to build a new Rome? Constantine stood on a windswept promontory, looking east across the Bosphorus. Behind him lay Europe. Before him, Asia. Beneath his feet, a small Greek town called Byzantium that had existed for nearly 1,000 years, quietly fishing and trading, largely ignored by history. But Constantine saw something others had missed. This narrow strip of land, barely 7 hills rising from the sea, sat at the exact point where two continents met, where the Mediterranean world touched the trade routes to Persia, India, and beyond, where sea lanes from the Black Sea funneled through a strait so narrow you could almost throw a stone across it. The strategic genius was immediately apparent to a military mind. Water protected the city on 3 sides, the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Bosphorus to the east, and a deep natural harbor called the Golden Horn to the north. Only one side needed defensive walls. A city here could be supplied by sea even if besieged by land. It could control all maritime trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. But Constantine's vision went deeper than military strategy. Rome itself was old, crowded with pagan temples and the memories of republican glory. The Senate still wielded power there, conservative and resistant to change. Here, on this empty promontory, Constantine could build something entirely new. A Christian Rome. A fresh start for a transforming empire. The year was 324 AD, and Constantine had just defeated his last rival for the imperial throne. He was sole ruler of the Roman Empire, the first emperor to embrace Christianity, and he stood at one of history's great crossroads. The old order was crumbling. Barbarian tribes pressed the northern frontiers. The western provinces grew increasingly difficult to defend. The empire's center of gravity was shifting inexorably eastward, where wealth, population, and trade were concentrated. Constantine made his decision. He would build a new capital, a new Rome. Here, on this windy peninsula between two seas, where the morning sun rose over Asia. Construction began almost immediately, on a scale that must have seemed impossible. Constantine ordered the old walls of Byzantium torn down and new ones built, encompassing a far larger area. He commanded that buildings be brought from across the empire, entire temples dismantled, marble columns shipped from Greece, bronze statues collected from Rome itself. Architects and engineers flooded in from everywhere. Skilled workers, common laborers, slaves, all converging on this growing city. The pace was relentless. Constantine wanted his new capital completed quickly, within his lifetime. Streets were laid out in a rough grid, following the contours of the seven hills. A great hippodrome for chariot races was constructed, capable of seating 100,000 spectators. Public baths rose, temples were converted to churches, aqueducts were built to bring water from distant springs. 6 years later, on May 11, 330 AD, Constantine formally dedicated his new capital, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The dedication ceremony blended Christian ritual with the old Roman traditions. Prayers were offered in the new churches. Games were held in the hippodrome. Free bread was distributed to the crowds. Constantine declared that Constantinople would have equal status with Rome itself. It would have its own senate, its own consul, all the institutions of Roman governance transplanted east. But something fundamental had changed. This wasn't merely Rome relocated. It was something new, a Christian capital for a Christian empire, a Greek-speaking city that preserved Roman law and institutions, a bridge between ancient traditions and a transformed future. Constantine didn't know it then, but his city would outlast the Rome it was meant to honor. Western Rome would fall within a century and a half. But Constantinople? Constantinople would stand for more than 1,100 years. Through barbarian invasions, religious controversies, sieges without number. It would become the beating heart of a civilization that kept the flame of classical learning alive through centuries when most of Europe couldn't read. This city, born from one emperor's vision on a windy peninsula, would become the longest-lasting capital in European history. And tonight we'll discover how it lived, how it thrived, and finally, how it fell. 2 centuries after Constantine's death, his successors faced a challenge that would define Byzantium forever. The year was 532 AD, and Constantinople was in ruins. Not from enemy attack, but from its own citizens. The Nika riots, a week of violence between chariot racing factions that spiraled into attempted revolution, had burned much of the city center. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the church of holy wisdom that Constantine had built, lay in smoking rubble. Emperor Justinian surveyed the destruction and saw not disaster, but opportunity. He would rebuild Hagia Sophia, yes, but not as it was. He would create something the world had never seen before. A church so magnificent, so impossibly vast, that it would proclaim to anyone who entered, "This is where heaven touches earth." You need to understand what Justinian was attempting. The Pantheon in Rome, that ancient temple with its massive dome, represented the pinnacle of Roman engineering. It had been built 400 years earlier, and no one had matched it since. Justinian wanted to exceed it, and he wanted to do it not with thick walls and solid construction, but with something that would seem to float. He found his architects, 2 men, Anthemius of Tralles, a mathematician and physicist, and Isidore of Miletus, a master of geometry and mechanics. Not traditional builders, but theoreticians. Men who understood mathematics, who could calculate forces and stresses, who thought in terms of principles rather than precedent. Together with Justinian, they conceived a design that must have seemed mad to conventional builders. A central dome, yes, but supported not by thick walls but by 4 massive arches. Half domes on 2 sides to buttress the central dome. And walls that were mostly windows, 40 arches around the base of the dome, each filled with glass so that light would pour in from every angle. The construction took 5 years, from 532 to 537 AD. 10,000 workers labored on the project. Materials came from across the empire and beyond. 8 porphyry columns were brought from the Temple of the Sun in Rome. Green marble from Thessaly, black stone from the Bosphorus, yellow stone from North Africa. The empire was ransacked for its treasures to build this single church. The dome itself was the unprecedented achievement. 100 feet in diameter, rising nearly 200 feet above the floor. Made of brick, 40 rows of bricks, each row slightly lighter than the one below, so that the dome grew less heavy as it rose. The mortar was mixed with a special lightweight aggregate. Every calculation, every choice of material, designed to reduce weight while maintaining strength. And then came the moment of truth. The moment when the scaffolding would be removed and they would discover whether the dome would stand or collapse. Imagine being Justinian that day. He had poured the empire's wealth into this building. If it failed, he would be remembered as a fool. The workers removed the supports, slowly, section by section. The dome settled slightly, just a few inches, as the weight redistributed itself along the arches. And it held. When Hagia Sophia was finally complete in December 537, Justinian entered the finished church for the first time. The accounts say he stood in silence for a long time, gazing up at the dome, at the way light poured through the 40 windows around its base so that it seemed to float, unsupported, in the air. Then he spoke 4 words that would be remembered forever. Solomon, I have surpassed thee. The dome of Hagia Sophia remains, even today, a mystery to engineers. How did Anthemius and Isidore, working without modern mathematics, without computers, without the ability to model stresses and forces, create something so precise? The dome has survived earthquakes that destroyed buildings around it. It's been standing for nearly 1,500 years. Modern engineers can analyze how it works. They can measure the distribution of forces, calculate the stress points, understand the genius of the design. But reproducing those same calculations without modern tools? That knowledge, that intuitive understanding of structure and forces, seems almost beyond human capacity. The church became instantly legendary. Visitors would enter through the massive bronze doors, and the first glimpse of that vast interior space, lit by thousands of candles and oil lamps, the golden mosaics catching and multiplying the light, the dome seeming to hover overhead without visible support, must have felt like stepping into a vision of heaven itself. Procopius, Justinian's court historian, tried to describe it and found words inadequate. He wrote that the dome does not appear to rest upon solid masonry, but to cover the space with its golden dome suspended from heaven. That phrase, suspended from heaven, captures what makes Hagia Sophia so extraordinary. It wasn't just that it was large, though it was the largest enclosed space in the world for nearly 1,000 years. It was that it achieved something that seemed impossible: monumentality without heaviness, vast space without oppression, engineering that felt like magic. The Byzantines believed that Hagia Sophia was built with divine help. Angels, they said, had assisted in the construction. And who could blame them for thinking so? When you stood beneath that dome, when you saw light pouring in from seemingly everywhere and nowhere, creating a luminous space that defied normal experience of architecture, it was easier to believe in miracles than in mathematics. Even now, as you rest comfortably, Hagia Sophia still stands in Istanbul. The mosaics are partially covered, the Christian symbols altered during its centuries as a mosque, now a museum, now a mosque again. Yet the dome remains, still floating, still impossible, still challenging every engineer who sees it to understand how 2 Byzantine architects achieved something that, by all rights, shouldn't have been possible. But Constantinople was more than monuments and emperors. It was a living city, home to hundreds of thousands of people who woke each morning to the sound of church bells and the call of street vendors. Let's walk through a day in 10th century Constantinople, when the city was at its zenith. Imagine you're standing in the district near the great marketplace, the sun just rising over the Asian shore across the Bosphorus. The city awakens early. Bakers have been working since before dawn, and now the smell of fresh bread drifts through narrow streets. The bread isn't like modern bread, it's coarser, made from wheat mixed with barley, sometimes sweetened with honey or flavored with herbs. By law, bakers must sell their bread at fixed prices, and inspectors check the weight and quality. Short weights or poor quality mean fines, sometimes worse. Water carriers are already working, hauling filled amphorae from the public fountains to households willing to pay rather than fetch their own. Constantinople has excellent water. Ancient Roman aqueducts, still functioning, bring spring water from the countryside. The water is stored in massive underground cisterns, some of them so vast they're held up by hundreds of columns, creating strange subterranean forests of stone. As the sun climbs higher, the streets fill with people. Constantinople is a polyglot city, a true crossroads. You hear Greek everywhere. It's become the common language of the empire, replacing Latin except in official documents and law courts. But you also hear Armenian, Arabic, Italian, Slavic languages, Persian. Merchants from Venice and Genoa have their own quarters. Russian traders arrive with furs and amber. Asian caravans bring silk and spices to the city's markets. The great marketplace, the Augusteum, sprawls across acres near Hagia Sophia. Here you can find anything the medieval world produces. Silk merchants sell fabric so fine it seems translucent. Byzantine silk is famous throughout the known world, and the secret of silk production, smuggled out of China by monks who hid silkworm eggs in hollow canes, is now one of the empire's most valuable monopolies. Spice vendors offer cinnamon, pepper, cloves, ginger, all worth their weight in silver. The air in their stalls is heavy with complex scents, exotic and overwhelming. Most spices come from distant lands the Byzantines know only vaguely, islands in distant seas, forests beyond deserts, places reached after months of travel through lands controlled by Arab or Persian intermediaries. Booksellers occupy their own section. Byzantine Constantinople is remarkably literate for a medieval city. The empire maintains schools, and education is valued. Classical Greek texts are copied and studied. Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the tragedians, all this ancient literature survives primarily because Byzantine scribes kept copying it, decade after decade, century after century. The booksellers' stalls smell of parchment and ink. Most books are religious, Bibles, liturgies, lives of saints, theological treatises. But classical works are available too, if you know what to ask for and have the silver to pay. A complete copy of Homer might cost as much as a good horse. Craftsmen work in specialized districts. The silversmiths have their street. The coppersmiths theirs. Jewelers cluster together. Shoemakers, tanners, relegated to the edge of town because of the smell. Each craft is organized into guilds with strict regulations. You can't simply decide to be a silversmith, you must apprentice for years, be accepted by the guild, follow their rules about quality, prices, working hours. The guilds maintain standards but also limit competition. It's a system designed for stability rather than innovation. At midday, the city pauses. It's too hot to work in the Mediterranean sun. People retreat indoors or to the shade of colonnades. Those who can afford it head to the public baths. The baths are everywhere in Constantinople, another inheritance from Rome. They're not merely for washing but social centers, places to meet friends, conduct business, hear news and gossip. The facilities are elaborate. Cold rooms, warm rooms, hot rooms, all heated by furnaces beneath the floors. Massage rooms, exercise areas. Some baths have libraries where you can read while you rest after bathing. The experience of the baths is luxurious but also communal. Men and women bathe separately, of course, but within each section, all classes mix. Nobles and merchants, craftsmen and laborers, all naked in the steam, all temporarily equal. It's one of the few places where social barriers momentarily dissolve. Late afternoon, the city stirs again. Markets reopen. Work resumes. But now there's a different quality to the activity. People are moving toward evening rituals. Church bells ring constantly in Constantinople. There are hundreds of churches, maybe thousands if you count small chapels. The sound of bells marks the hours, calls the faithful to prayer, announces events and celebrations. It's the soundtrack of Byzantine life, as constant as the sound of waves against the sea walls. As darkness falls, the city transforms. Oil lamps are lit in homes and churches. The main streets have public lighting, another Roman tradition maintained, but most areas grow dark and somewhat dangerous. People hurry home, close their shutters, bolt their doors. The night watch patrols, their footsteps echoing on stone streets, calling out the hours. In wealthier homes, evening meals are served. Bread, of course, olive oil, wine always mixed with water. Drinking undiluted wine is considered barbaric. Fish is common, both fresh from the Bosphorus and preserved. Vegetables, fruits, cheese. Meat is rarer, expensive, saved for special occasions. Then sleep, in a city that never falls entirely silent. Even at midnight, you can hear the sound of the sea, the cry of night watchmen, the distant bells of churches where monks maintain vigils. Constantinople sleeps but remains alive, a city of 500,000 souls breathing together under the same stars that shine on Rome, Baghdad, distant China. This was the rhythm of life in the world's greatest city. Not spectacular, not dramatic. Just human beings living, working, worrying about bread prices and their children's futures. The same concerns people have always had, will always have, dressed in Byzantine garb and speaking medieval Greek. Yet Constantinople faced constant threats, and it possessed one weapon that terrified its enemies more than anything else in the medieval world. They called it Greek fire. Imagine you're an Arab sailor in the year 678 AD, part of a massive fleet besieging Constantinople from the sea. Your ships outnumber the Byzantine vessels. Victory seems certain. Then, as you approach the walls, Byzantine warships maneuver close, and strange tubes mounted on their bows point toward your fleet. A gout of liquid fire erupts from the tubes. It arcs through the air, trailing flame. It splashes across the wooden deck of a nearby ship. And then chaos. The fire burns with impossible intensity. It sticks to everything it touches. Worse, impossibly worse, it burns on water. Sailors leap overboard to escape the flames, only to find the sea itself burning around them. Water doesn't extinguish Greek fire. If anything, water seems to feed it, make it spread faster. Within minutes, the Arab fleet is in full retreat, ships burning, men dying in waters turned to flame. The siege is broken. Constantinople is saved. and to this day we don't know exactly what Greek fire was. The Byzantines called it liquid fire or manufactured fire. The secret of its composition was one of the most closely guarded state secrets in history. Only a handful of people knew the formula. It was passed down from emperor to emperor, from master chemist to apprentice, always in strictest secrecy. Revealing the secret was treason punishable by death. The weapon was invented, according to tradition, by a Greek architect and chemist named Kallinikos who fled from Syria to Constantinople in 668 AD. The Arab conquest was sweeping through the region, and Kallinikos brought with him knowledge of incendiary weapons. He refined this knowledge, creating something unprecedented. The Byzantine navy adopted it immediately. What made Greek fire so devastating wasn't just that it burned fiercely. Many incendiary substances existed in the ancient world. But Greek fire had several unique properties that made it unlike anything else. First, it could be projected through tubes, essentially primitive flamethrowers mounted on Byzantine warships. The tubes were called siphons, operated by forcing the liquid fire through them using some form of pump or pressure system. The flame would shoot out dozens of feet, allowing ships to attack from a distance. Second, it burned on water. This property alone made naval combat against Byzantium terrifying. Wooden ships are inherently vulnerable to fire, but normally sailors could douse flames with water or jump overboard to escape. Greek fire eliminated those options. The sea itself became a death trap. Third, conventional methods couldn't extinguish it. Water didn't work. According to some accounts, water actually made it burn more intensely. The only substances said to have any effect were vinegar, sand, or urine. But in the chaos of a burning ship, organizing an effective response was nearly impossible. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine being a sailor in any fleet that had to face Byzantine ships. You know that they possess this terrifying weapon. You've heard stories, perhaps from survivors, perhaps from those who witnessed previous battles. The fear alone gave Byzantium an enormous advantage. For centuries, Greek fire saved Constantinople. It broke Arab sieges in 678 and again in 717–718. It defeated Russian fleets. It turned the tide in countless smaller engagements. Byzantine naval superiority rested substantially on this one secret weapon. So what was it? Modern historians and chemists have spent decades trying to answer this question. No complete formula survives. The secret died with the empire. What we have are descriptions of its effects and occasional hints about possible ingredients. Most scholars believe Greek fire was based on petroleum or naphtha, crude oil, essentially, which the Byzantines could have obtained from natural seeps in the region around the Black Sea. But crude oil alone doesn't explain all the properties. Something else must have been added. Quicklime is one candidate. Quicklime reacts violently with water, producing heat. Mix quicklime with petroleum and you might get something that burns more intensely when water hits it. But quicklime is a powder. How do you suspend it in liquid petroleum? How do you pump such a mixture through tubes without it clogging? Sulfur is another possibility. Mixed with petroleum and perhaps saltpeter potassium nitrate, you could create something approaching an early form of gunpowder combined with napalm. This might explain the adherent quality, the way it stuck to surfaces and continued burning. Resin from pine trees was definitely used in ancient incendiary weapons. It's sticky, flammable, and would help the mixture adhere to ship hulls and sails. Byzantine sources mention resin in connection with naval weapons. But here's the puzzle. Modern chemists can create substances with similar effects using these ingredients. We can make things that burn on water, that stick to surfaces, that shoot from tubes. Yet we can't perfectly reproduce what contemporary sources describe. There's always something slightly off, some property that doesn't quite match the historical accounts. Perhaps the Byzantines discovered a specific combination, a precise ratio of ingredients that created synergistic effects. Perhaps there was an additional ingredient we haven't identified. Perhaps the secret wasn't just the formula but the manufacturing process, specific temperatures, mixing methods, preparation techniques that were never written down. Or perhaps the historical accounts exaggerated. Victory in battle often makes weapons seem more effective than they were. Fear and rumor amplify. Maybe Greek fire was less miraculous than the sources suggest, merely a very good incendiary weapon that gained legendary status. But this seems unlikely. Too many independent sources describe its effects. Too many battles turned on its use. Too many enemies tried desperately to steal the secret and failed. If it were merely an ordinary incendiary, surely someone would have duplicated it. The Byzantines themselves clearly believed it was special, even divine. They attributed its invention to divine inspiration. Emperors, in their testaments to their heirs, included solemn warnings never to reveal the secret of liquid fire. One emperor wrote that the formula was shown and revealed by an angel to the great and holy Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Whether you believe in angelic intervention or Byzantine chemistry, the result was the same. For half a millennium, Constantinople possessed a weapon its enemies couldn't match. And when the empire finally fell, the secret of Greek fire vanished with it, leaving us with accounts, descriptions, and theories, but never quite the truth. Somewhere in the historical record, encrypted in fragments and hints, the formula still exists. Waiting, as mysterious now as it was terrifying then. While Greek fire defended the city's walls, another kind of preservation was happening in quieter rooms throughout Constantinople. In monasteries and palace libraries, in university halls and private studies, Byzantine scribes were engaged in one of history's most important tasks. They were copying books. Day after day, year after year, century after century. Copying. It sounds simple, even tedious. But this patient, unglamorous work saved Western civilization. Imagine a scriptorium in a Constantinople monastery in the year 900 AD. A long room with high windows letting in north light, the best light for reading, steady and cool. 20 monks sit at individual desks, each bent over a manuscript, copying word by word, line by line. The only sounds are the scratch of reed pens on parchment and the occasional murmur of someone reading aloud to themselves to catch the rhythm of ancient Greek. What are they copying? Homer's epics, Plato's dialogues, Euclid's geometry, Aristotle's philosophy and science, the plays of Sophocles and Euripides, mathematical treatises, medical texts by Galen and Hippocrates. Everything the ancient Greeks had written, everything that hadn't already been lost to fire, water, or simple neglect. Books don't last forever. Parchment decays. Ink fades. Bindings crumble. A manuscript might last a few centuries if carefully preserved. But eventually it must be copied again, or the knowledge it contains will vanish. In Western Europe, after Rome fell, this copying largely stopped. Some monasteries in Ireland and a few other places kept the tradition alive, but on a much smaller scale. Most classical texts simply weren't being preserved. They were forgotten or deliberately discarded as pagan works unsuitable for Christian readers. But in Constantinople, the copying continued. The Byzantines saw no conflict between Christianity and classical learning. Plato and Aristotle, they believed, had anticipated Christian truths through reason. The ancient philosophers were teachers who prepared the world for the gospel. Their works deserved preservation, study, and respect. The University of Constantinople, founded in 425 AD, maintained this tradition. It taught the traditional curriculum: grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, music. Students learned classical Greek, studied the ancient texts, engaged with ideas that were already 1,000 years old. When Western Europe was struggling with basic literacy, Constantinople was debating Neoplatonism. The work of copying was painstaking. A scribe might spend a full day copying just a few pages. A complete manuscript of Homer, the Iliad, and Odyssey together might take 6 months. Aristotle's complete works? A year or more. Errors were inevitable. A scribe's hand might slip. Eyes might skip a line. An ambiguous word might be misread. Over generations of copying, small errors accumulated. This is why textual scholarship exists, trying to work backward through layers of copying to reconstruct what the original author actually wrote. But the Byzantines were remarkably good at this work. They developed careful proofreading procedures. Multiple scribes would check each other's work. When possible, they compared different versions of the same text, trying to identify and correct errors. They understood the importance of what they were doing. Not everything survived. We know from references and quotations that countless works have been lost. Of the 70-plus plays Aeschylus wrote, only 7 survive. Sophocles wrote over 100, we have 7. Entire genres of Greek literature are known only from fragments and descriptions. The mathematician Archimedes wrote many works. Several survive, but only because Byzantine scribes copied them. One treatise, The Method, was completely lost for centuries. Then in 1906, a scholar discovered it hidden beneath the text of a Byzantine prayer book. Someone had scraped off the Archimedes text and reused the expensive parchment. The mathematical content was recovered using modern imaging techniques. It contained ideas about infinity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the development of calculus. That's what was at stake. Not just old stories and poems, but mathematical and scientific knowledge that could accelerate or retard human progress by centuries. Every text that wasn't copied was potentially a permanent loss for humanity. The Byzantines also preserved Roman law. Emperor Justinian, in the 6th century, ordered a systematic compilation of all Roman legal knowledge. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It collected and organized centuries of legal principles, court decisions, and imperial edicts. This work became the foundation for legal systems across Europe. When Western Europe began to develop more sophisticated legal structures in the Middle Ages, they turned to Justinian's codification. Modern concepts like contracts, property rights, legal procedure, much of this comes from Roman law as preserved and transmitted by Byzantium. The process of preservation wasn't passive. Byzantine scholars didn't just copy. They also commented, analyzed, and explained. They wrote extensive annotations on classical texts, explaining obscure references, defining archaic words, providing historical context. These scholia, as they're called, are often our only window into lost works or forgotten historical events. When Constantinople fell in 1453, Byzantine scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts. They found refuge in Italy, where their knowledge helped spark the Renaissance. Italian humanists suddenly had access to Greek texts they'd only heard about. Plato's complete works, for example, were largely unknown in Western Europe until Byzantine refugees brought them to Florence. The impact was revolutionary. Renaissance thinkers could now read ancient philosophy and science in the original Greek rather than through garbled Latin translations. They discovered that the classical world had been more sophisticated, more nuanced, more interesting than medieval summaries had suggested. This sparked new ways of thinking about art, politics, science, and human nature. So when we read Plato today or study Euclidean geometry or quote Sophocles, we're reading texts that survived only because Byzantine scribes kept copying them. Century after century, through invasions and economic hardship, through theological controversies and political upheavals, they kept working, scratching away with reed pens, preserving what could so easily have been lost forever. It's one of history's quiet miracles. Not dramatic, not glorious, just patient labor in long rooms filled with northern light. The slow, careful work of ensuring that the wisdom of the past would reach the future. Let's return to the 6th century, to the reign of Justinian, and meet one of the most remarkable couples in history. Theodora was born around 500 AD into the lowest ranks of Byzantine society. Her father was a bear keeper at the hippodrome. He looked after the bears used in animal shows. When he died, the family fell into even deeper poverty. Theodora and her sisters turned to the stage. In Byzantine Constantinople, actresses were associated with prostitution. Theater wasn't respectable. Performers were considered morally suspect, barred from marriage to aristocrats by law. Theodora worked in the theater in her youth. Exactly what she did there is unclear, though contemporary hostile sources made lurid claims. What's certain is that she left Constantinople, traveled to North Africa, and at some point underwent a profound personal transformation. She became deeply religious, perhaps living in a religious community for a time. When she returned to Constantinople, she was a changed woman, intelligent, educated, and determined. Justinian met her when he was heir to the throne, already in his 30s. His uncle, Emperor Justin, had risen from peasant origins to the purple. Justinian was being groomed to succeed him, and Justinian fell completely in love with Theodora. The problem was that law forbids senators from marrying actresses. Justinian couldn't marry her as long as that law stood. So he convinced his uncle to change the law. The new decree stated that if an actress reformed her ways and the emperor approved, she could marry a senator. They married around 525 AD. When Justinian became emperor 2 years later, Theodora became empress, not just the emperor's wife, but full co-ruler. She was crowned alongside him, her image appeared on coins, and she exercised real political power. The partnership was genuine. Justinian and Theodora ruled together for more than 20 years, until her death in 548. They were almost certainly in love. Justinian consulted her on everything, sought her advice, defended her against critics. When she died, he was reportedly devastated, and never remarried. But this wasn't just a love story. Theodora was politically brilliant. Perhaps because of her low origins, she understood how power actually worked in ways that aristocrats, raised in privilege, never quite grasped. During the Nika riots in 532, When rioters nearly toppled Justinian from power, it was Theodora who saved the throne. Justinian and his advisors were ready to flee the city. Ships waited in the harbor. The mob controlled much of Constantinople. Running seemed the only option. Theodora gave a speech that's been remembered for 15 centuries. According to the historian Procopius, she said, "As for me, I agree with the old saying that the purple is the best burial shroud." In other words, she would rather die as empress than live as a fugitive. Her courage shamed the men into staying. Justinian's general Belisarius then led troops to the Hippodrome where the mob had gathered and put down the rebellion with lethal force. Thousands died, but Justinian's reign was saved. Theodora used her power in interesting ways. She established a convent where former prostitutes could go to escape that life. She pushed for laws protecting women's rights, giving women more control over their property, making divorce easier for women to obtain, increasing penalties for rape. Byzantine law under Justinian and Theodora became notably more favorable to women than it had been. She also involved herself deeply in religious controversies. The Byzantine Empire was perpetually torn by theological debates that seem obscure today but were matters of passionate concern then. Theodora supported the Monophysite position, a particular understanding of Christ's nature that was considered heretical by the mainstream church. She protected Monophysite clergy, provided them with resources, worked behind the scenes to advance their cause. This created a strange situation. The emperor supported Orthodox Christianity, while the empress supported heresy. Justinian may have allowed this deliberately, as a way to keep both sides somewhat satisfied. Or perhaps he simply couldn't control her. Theodora did what she believed was right, regardless of political convenience. She was also ruthless when necessary. Byzantine politics was deadly, plots, assassinations, and intrigue were constant. Theodora built her own intelligence network, maintained her own loyal supporters, and eliminated threats without hesitation. People feared her, with good reason. Justinian, meanwhile, was pursuing his grand vision of restoring the Roman Empire. He launched military campaigns to reconquer lost Western territories. His generals, particularly Belisarius, won stunning victories in North Africa and Italy. For a brief moment, much of the old Roman world was reunited under Constantinople's rule. But these conquests were expensive and ultimately temporary. The empire lacked the resources to hold such vast territories. Within decades, much of what Justinian had reconquered was lost again. His wars may have actually weakened the empire by draining its wealth and manpower. His more lasting achievements were in law and architecture. The codification of Roman law we discussed earlier was Justinian's project. He wanted to organize, rationalize, and preserve the legal wisdom of centuries. And of course, there was Hagia Sophia, his architectural masterpiece that still stands today. Theodora died in 548, probably from cancer. She was around 48 years old. Justinian lived another 17 years, dying in 565 at the age of 82. He never stopped mourning her. After her death, he consulted no one the way he had consulted her. Something went out of him when she died. Their reign was controversial then and remains so now. The conquests were costly failures. The laws were sometimes harsh. The religious policies satisfied no one fully. Yet they left an enormous legacy in law, architecture, and the simple fact that an actress from the slums could become an empress and rule alongside her husband as an equal. Theodora's story, in particular, reveals something important about Byzantium. It was a rigid, hierarchical society in many ways, but it wasn't completely closed. Someone could rise from nothing to everything. Merit, intelligence, and determination mattered. Even a woman from the lowest ranks could reshape an empire. In the mosaics of Ravenna, you can still see them. Justinian and Theodora, facing each other across the altar of San Vitale, crowned and haloed, surrounded by their courts. Partners in power, equal in majesty. Two people who shouldn't have mattered, a peasant's nephew and a bear-keeper's daughter, who together shaped the course of a civilization. For centuries, Christianity had been one church, united despite theological disagreements. But beneath the surface, tensions were growing between the Eastern Church centered in Constantinople and the Western Church centered in Rome. In 1054, these tensions finally ruptured, splitting Christianity into two branches that remain separate today. The split wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of centuries of drift. Language was part of it. The Western Church used Latin. The Eastern Church used Greek. As the centuries passed, fewer and fewer church leaders were fluent in both languages. Theological texts written in one language weren't always accurately translated into the other. Misunderstandings accumulated. Nuances were lost. Political separation reinforced religious separation. After Western Rome fell in 476, the Pope was no longer under the same imperial authority as the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Bishop of Rome began to develop independent power, becoming both a spiritual and temporal ruler. The Patriarch of Constantinople, by contrast, remained under the Byzantine emperor's authority. This created different attitudes toward church-state relations. In the West, the Church increasingly saw itself as independent from secular rulers, sometimes even superior to them. In the East, Church and state remained intertwined. The emperor was God's chosen ruler on earth, the protector of the Church. Separation of church and state wasn't really a concept. Theological differences emerged too. The most famous was the Filioque controversy. This concerned one single word in the Nicene Creed, the fundamental statement of Christian belief. The original creed, agreed upon by church councils, stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Western churches began adding "and the Son," Filioque in Latin. So the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. To modern ears, this might seem like splitting hairs, but it mattered immensely to medieval theologians. It affected how they understood the nature of the Trinity, the relationship between the three persons of God. The Eastern Church saw the Western addition as heretical, a dangerous innovation that distorted Christian doctrine. The Western Church saw the Eastern resistance as stubborn traditionalism. The addition, they argued, clarified the truth. The Eastern refusal to accept it was obstinacy. There were other differences too. The use of unleavened bread in communion. Whether priests should be allowed to marry. The exact wording of various prayers. Details that wouldn't seem to justify schism, but which took on enormous importance in the context of growing cultural and political separation. The final break came in 1054, though neither side probably realized at the time that it would be permanent. A delegation from Rome, led by Cardinal Humbert, came to Constantinople to negotiate with Patriarch Michael Cerularius. The negotiations went badly. Humbert was arrogant. Cerularius was inflexible. Neither man was inclined toward compromise. Finally, on July 16, 1054, Cardinal Humbert entered Hagia Sophia during services and placed a bull of excommunication on the altar. The document excommunicated Patriarch Cerularius and his followers, declaring them cut off from the true church. Cerularius responded by excommunicating Humbert and his delegation. Technically, this exchange only excommunicated the individuals involved, not the entire Eastern and Western churches. But in practice, it formalized a split that had been developing for centuries. The one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church was now two: the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 made the schism worse. Western Crusaders, supposedly on their way to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, were diverted to Constantinople. They sacked the city, looting churches, stealing relics, destroying irreplaceable treasures. Latin Crusaders installed a Latin emperor and a Latin patriarch in Constantinople. To the Byzantines, this was the ultimate betrayal. Fellow Christians had destroyed their city more thoroughly than any Muslim army ever had. The memories of 1204 poisoned relations between East and West for centuries. Many Byzantines concluded they'd rather be ruled by Muslims than submit to the papacy. The schism was never formally healed. There were attempts at reconciliation, most notably at the Council of Florence in 1439. Byzantine negotiators, desperate for Western military aid against the advancing Ottomans, agreed to reunion under papal authority. But when they returned to Constantinople, the agreement was rejected by most of the clergy and people. One Byzantine official supposedly said, "Better the Turkish turban than the Latin mitre." Today, more than 970 years later, the schism persists. The Catholic and Orthodox churches have made friendly gestures. In 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I formally lifted the mutual excommunications of 1054. But the churches remain separate with different structures, different practices, different theological emphases. The Great Schism reminds us how difficult it is to maintain unity across vast distances and diverging cultures. What starts as a single tradition gradually becomes two as circumstances change, languages drift, and political interests diverge. Small differences accumulate into large ones. Eventually, the gap becomes too wide to bridge. And perhaps there's something inevitable about it. Christianity in Greek-speaking Constantinople, embedded in surviving Roman imperial structures, naturally developed differently from Christianity in Latin-speaking Rome, surrounded by new Germanic kingdoms. Same scriptures, same basic beliefs, but different contexts producing different expressions. The tragedy is that it happened at all. The tragedy is that Christian unity, which had survived persecution and heresy and centuries of expansion, finally couldn't survive geography and politics. The Fourth Crusade should never have gone to Constantinople. It was supposed to go to Egypt to strike at Muslim power at its center. Instead, it destroyed the greatest Christian city in the world. The story of how this happened reveals much about medieval politics, greed, and the unintended consequences of well-meaning disasters. In 1202, Crusaders gathered in Venice, planning to sail to the Holy Land. But there was a problem. They couldn't pay Venice for the ships and supplies they'd contracted. The Venetians, led by their aged but formidable Doge Enrico Dandolo, had a solution. The Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice capture Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast. This was already troubling. Crusaders fighting other Christians? But it got worse. Then a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, appeared with a proposition. His father had been emperor until his uncle overthrew him and blinded him, a common Byzantine method of removing rivals since a blind man couldn't rule. Young Alexios promised that if the Crusaders helped him regain the throne, he would pay them handsomely and reunite the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority. The Crusade leaders accepted. Perhaps they believed Alexios. Perhaps they simply wanted the promised wealth. In 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived at Constantinople. Imagine seeing that sight from the city walls. Hundreds of ships, thousands of armed men, siege engines, cavalry. The largest and most sophisticated army ever assembled in the medieval period, supposedly fighting for Christ, now threatening the greatest Christian city on earth. The usurper emperor fled. Alexios was installed as co-emperor alongside his blind father. But he couldn't fulfill his promises. The Byzantine treasury didn't have the wealth he'd promised. The Byzantine Church would never accept papal authority. The people of Constantinople hated their new emperor and the foreign army camped outside their walls. Tensions escalated. Riots broke out. Alexios was overthrown and murdered in a palace coup. The new emperor refused to pay the Crusaders anything. The Crusade leaders made a fateful decision. They would take Constantinople by force, install their own emperor, and divide the Byzantine Empire among themselves. On April 12, 1204, they broke through the walls. And then, for 3 days, they sacked Constantinople. What followed was one of history's greatest cultural catastrophes. The Crusaders looted everything. Churches were ransacked. Sacred relics were stolen. Libraries were burned. Artworks accumulated over 900 years were destroyed or carried off. Hagia Sophia itself was desecrated. Crusaders broke open the altar, stealing the precious metals. They brought horses and mules into the church to carry off the loot, and when the animals slipped on the marble floors, they left them lying there. A prostitute was reportedly seated on the patriarch's throne, singing bawdy songs. The 4 bronze horses that stood atop the hippodrome, ancient artworks of incalculable value, were torn down and shipped to Venice. They still stand there today, on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica, beautiful reminders of a terrible crime. Irreplaceable manuscripts were burned for warmth or used as packing material. Golden reliquaries were melted down for the raw metal. Jeweled icons were pried apart for their gems. 9 centuries of accumulated culture, treated as mere plunder. The historian Nicetas Choniates, who witnessed the sack, wrote that even the Muslim capture of Jerusalem by Saladin had been more merciful. The Saracens, he wrote, are merciful and kind compared to these men who bear the cross of Christ on their shoulders. The Crusaders installed a Latin emperor and divided Byzantine territories among themselves. The Latin Empire lasted less than 60 years. Byzantine Greeks, retreating to Nicaea in Anatolia, eventually recaptured Constantinople in 1261. But the city never fully recovered. Much of its wealth was gone. Its population had declined dramatically. Large parts of the city lay empty and ruined. The empire that had once stretched from Italy to Armenia was now reduced to the city itself and scattered territories in Greece. Perhaps worst of all, the psychological damage was permanent. The Byzantines had always seen themselves as the true Romans, the inheritors of classical civilization, the defenders of Christendom. Then their fellow Christians had destroyed them more thoroughly than any pagan or Muslim army. The bitterness this created never really faded. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, many Byzantines saw it as divine punishment for the sins of 1204. Some even welcomed Turkish rule as preferable to submission to Rome. The Fourth Crusade is often called the greatest crime committed in the name of Christ. It weakened Christian Byzantium at the exact moment when a unified Christian front was needed against rising Muslim power. It destroyed irreplaceable cultural treasures. It made the eventual fall of Constantinople almost inevitable. And it began with debt problems and a deposed prince's false promises. No one set out to destroy Byzantium. No one planned this catastrophe. It emerged from a series of bad decisions, each one seemingly rational at the time, each one leading inexorably to disaster. Pope Innocent III, who had called the crusade, was horrified when he learned what happened. He excommunicated the crusade leaders, but the damage was done. Constantinople lay in ruins, and the Christian world was permanently fractured. Walk into Hagia Sophia even today, and you'll see them, Byzantine mosaics that have survived nearly 1,000 years. Golden backgrounds that still seem to glow with an inner light. Faces of saints and emperors that still possess a living presence. The Byzantines created some of history's most beautiful art. And much of the technical knowledge that made it possible remains mysterious. Byzantine mosaics weren't paintings. They were made of thousands of tiny pieces of colored glass and stone called tesserae, each piece individually set into wet plaster at carefully calculated angles. The process was painstaking, expensive, and required extraordinary skill. The golden backgrounds that dominate Byzantine art were created using gold tesserae. These weren't solid gold. That would be impossibly expensive and impractical. Instead, craftsmen created glass sandwiches. They would place a thin sheet of gold leaf between two layers of glass, heat them until they fused, then cut the cooled glass into tiny squares. But here's what's mysterious. The gold in Byzantine mosaics has a quality that modern reproductions can't quite match. It glows, not just reflects light, but seems to emanate light from within. Stand in Hagia Sophia or the churches of Ravenna, and the gold backgrounds create an atmosphere that's difficult to describe, something between earthly beauty and otherworldly radiance. Modern researchers studying Byzantine mosaics have discovered several possible factors. First, the gold leaf was sometimes extremely thin, only a few micrometers thick. This thinness affects how light interacts with it, creating subtle optical effects. Second, the glass itself wasn't perfectly clear. Medieval glass often contained impurities and tiny bubbles. These imperfections scatter and refract light in ways that pure modern glass doesn't. What might seem like a flaw in manufacturing actually contributes to the aesthetic effect. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the tesserae weren't set flat. Byzantine mosaicists deliberately set each piece at a slightly different angle, creating an irregular surface. When light hits this surface, it reflects in many different directions. This creates a shimmering, living quality that flat surfaces can't achieve. But reproducing this effect requires extraordinary skill. A mosaicist had to know exactly what angle to set each piece, had to maintain this precision across thousands of tesserae, had to envision how the whole work would look when complete. No preliminary sketching could fully capture this. It required intuitive understanding built through years of training. The colors Byzantine artists could achieve were also remarkable. They used glass colored with various metal oxides. Cobalt for deep blues, copper for greens and turquoise, manganese for purple, iron for reds and browns. But the exact formulas for some colors have been lost. There's a particular deep red used in early Byzantine mosaics that researchers haven't been able to perfectly replicate. Something about the precise combination of materials and firing temperatures created a color quality that seems beyond our current reach. Byzantine artists also used expensive materials for certain colors. True ultramarine blue, the color reserved for the Virgin Mary's robes in many icons, was made from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan. It was literally worth more than gold by weight. Using it for large areas of mosaic represented enormous expenditure. The iconography of Byzantine art followed strict rules. This wasn't just decoration, it was theology made visual. Every gesture, every color, every arrangement had specific meaning. Christ was always depicted certain ways. The Virgin Mary had established poses. Saints carried their traditional symbols. This might seem restrictive, but within these rules, artists found remarkable creative freedom. The same subject could be rendered in countless ways, each bringing new emotional depth or theological insight. Creativity came not from innovating wildly, but from subtle variations within a learned tradition. Some of the most moving Byzantine mosaics are portraits. Not of saints or emperors, but of ordinary donors, the people who paid for the church or monastery. These faces look out across centuries with surprising humanity. You can see personality there, individual character. These weren't idealized types, but specific people, captured in tiny pieces of colored glass. The iconoclasm controversy in the 8th and 9th centuries destroyed countless Byzantine artworks. Iconoclasts, icon breakers, believed that religious images were idolatrous. They smashed mosaics, burned icons, whitewashed church walls. Monks and artists who resisted were persecuted, sometimes killed. The controversy lasted over a century. When it finally ended and religious images were restored, many masterworks were gone forever. What survives is a fraction of what Byzantine artists created. Yet even this fraction is breathtaking. The churches of Ravenna, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, the monasteries of Mount Athos, churches throughout Greece and the Balkans. Wherever you find Byzantine mosaics, that strange golden glow persists. Modern conservators work carefully to preserve these ancient artworks. But the work is delicate. The tesserae are held in place by centuries-old mortar. Touch them too aggressively and they fall out. Environmental conditions matter, humidity, temperature changes, pollution all cause damage. And we can't really replace what's lost. Modern mosaicists can create beautiful work, but it's not quite the same. Some combination of materials, technique, and accumulated knowledge is missing. We can analyze and approximate, but perfect reproduction eludes us. Perhaps that's appropriate. Byzantine art was created for a specific purpose, to create sacred space, to make visible the invisible, to bridge earth and heaven. It emerged from a particular religious vision, a particular cultural moment. That moment is gone. What remains are these glowing fragments, beautiful and mysterious, still accomplishing what they were made to do, lifting the eyes and heart towards something beyond the everyday. Even now, as you rest, those mosaics continue their quiet work, still glowing in dim churches, still testifying to the skill of unknown artists, still beautiful after almost a millennium, still keeping their secrets. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to almost nothing. Just Constantinople itself, a few islands, and some territory in the Peloponnese. The once mighty empire was now a single city, surrounded by Ottoman territory, waiting for the inevitable. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly determined to capture Constantinople. His predecessors had tried and failed. He would succeed. He prepared meticulously. On the European side of the Bosphorus, just north of Constantinople, he built a fortress called Rum-Eli Hazara ±. It controlled the strait, preventing ships from bringing supplies to the city. Constantinople was now completely isolated. More ominously, Mehmed commissioned cannon. Not ordinary cannon, but monsters. The largest, built by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton. Nothing like it had ever been built before. It took 60 oxen to move and required 2 hours to reload. But it could shatter walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Emperor Constantine XI knew what was coming. He sent desperate appeals to Western Europe for help. A few hundred soldiers arrived from Venice and Genoa. The Pope promised aid in exchange for accepting papal authority, but this aid never materialized, and the religious concession angered many Byzantines. In the end, Constantine had perhaps 7,000 defenders. Mehmed had somewhere between 50 and 80,000 men, sources vary, but the Ottoman army vastly outnumbered the defenders. The siege began on April 6, 1453. Mehmed's army surrounded the land walls, his fleet blockaded the harbor. The massive cannons began their slow, devastating work. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, extended and strengthened over the centuries, had never been breached by siege. They consisted of 3 lines of defense: an outer moat, an outer wall, and finally the massive inner wall, up to 20 feet thick in places. 96 towers studded the walls, providing defensive positions. But walls built to withstand medieval battering rams couldn't withstand massive cannon. Each shot from Urban's monster gun shook the ground like an earthquake. Stone balls crashed into the walls, shattering ancient masonry. The defenders worked frantically each night to repair the damage, packing rubble and timber into the breaches. But each day, the cannons opened new gaps. The Byzantines used every defensive technique they knew. They lowered bales of wool from the walls to absorb the impact of cannonballs. They built wooden palisades behind breached sections. They launched night sorties trying to destroy the cannon. Greek fire, that ancient secret weapon, was reportedly used one last time. But gradually, inexorably, the situation grew more desperate. Food supplies dwindled. The defenders were exhausted from constant fighting and nightly repairs. More and more of the wall was damaged beyond proper repair. Religious processions moved through the streets. Icons were carried along the walls. Prayers never ceased. The last emperor of the Romans participated in these rituals, appearing among his people, sharing their vigil. Mehmed offered terms. Surrender the city, and the inhabitants would be spared. Constantine refused. He reportedly said he would give up anything except the city itself. Constantinople was his trust, his inheritance. He would defend it while he lived. The night of May 28, 1453, was quiet. The cannons had stopped. Everyone knew the final assault would come at dawn. Constantine gathered his commanders for a last meeting. He thanked them for their service. He asked forgiveness if he had ever offended anyone. They asked his forgiveness in return. Then he rode out to inspect the walls one final time. A last service was held in Hagia Sophia. Orthodox and Catholic, Byzantine and Latin, all differences forgotten, prayed together under that floating dome. It was said that the church had never been so full. Constantine attended, then returned to his post at the walls. The assault began just before dawn on May 29th. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers attacked. The defenders threw them back repeatedly. For hours, the outcome hung in balance. The Byzantines fought with desperate courage. They knew they were fighting for everything: their city, their faith, their civilization. Then disaster struck. A small gate called the Kirka Porta, which had been used for sorties, had been left unlocked. A few dozen Ottomans discovered it and got through. Once inside, they raised the Ottoman flag on a tower. When the defenders saw the flag, some panicked. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, was wounded and withdrew. Confusion spread. The defense began to collapse. Constantine XI saw it happening. He knew the city was lost. According to the accounts, though historians debate their accuracy, he tore off his imperial regalia, drew his sword, and charged into the breach with a handful of companions. The last emperor of Rome died fighting like a common soldier. His body was never identified with certainty. He disappeared into the chaos of the final battle, becoming part of legend. By midday it was over. Ottoman soldiers poured through the broken walls. Mehmed entered the city in triumph, riding straight to Hagia Sophia. He climbed from his horse, bent down, and took up a handful of earth, pouring it over his turban as a gesture of humility before God. Then he entered the church. He stopped a soldier who was breaking up the marble floor for loot, reminding him that the building itself now belonged to the Sultan. Hagia Sophia would be converted into a mosque, but the structure would be preserved. That dome would continue to float. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. The city that had stood for 1100 years was gone. The last link to Rome broken. The empire that had preserved classical civilization through the Dark Ages, extinguished. But Byzantium's legacy didn't die. Scholars fled west, carrying manuscripts and knowledge. Orthodox Christianity continued in Greece, Russia, and the Balkans. Byzantine law influenced legal systems for centuries. And Constantinople itself, now Istanbul, remained a great city, inheriting the Byzantine past even as it built an Ottoman future. The story ends as all stories do, with loss and memory and the long shadow of what came before. Constantinople fell, but Byzantium did not entirely die. When the city fell in 1453, scholars fled west, carrying manuscripts, knowledge, memories. They found homes in Venice, in Rome, in Florence. The classical Greek texts they brought with them, preserved for 1,000 years by Byzantine scribes, helped spark the Renaissance. Today, in Istanbul, the walls still stand. Hagia Sophia still dominates the skyline, that impossible dome still floating after nearly 1,500 years. The Byzantine mosaics still glow with their mysterious light. If you walk the old streets, you can still trace the outline of the ancient city, still see where Constantine's vision took physical form. The Orthodox Church continues, carrying forward Byzantine liturgy and theology. Byzantine art influences religious iconography to this day, and scattered through museum collections worldwide are fragments of that lost civilization. Icons, manuscripts, jewelry, mosaics, beautiful reminders of a world that's gone. The story of Constantinople teaches something about human persistence. For 1,100 years, through invasion, plague, schism, betrayal, siege after siege, the city endured. Not through military might alone, but through preservation of knowledge, through cultural resilience, through the stubborn human refusal to let civilization die. What the Byzantines saved, Greek philosophy, Roman law, classical literature, mathematical and scientific texts, formed the foundation for everything that came after. Without their patient, centuries-long effort of copying and preserving, much of the ancient world's wisdom would have vanished forever. They weren't perfect. They were often rigid, sometimes cruel, frequently divided against themselves. But they kept the light burning through what could have been a complete dark age. They maintained the possibility of a better future. You are connected to this story. The words you read, the ideas you encounter, the very concept of democracy and citizenship, all flowed through Constantinople on their journey from ancient Greece and Rome to the modern world. You inherit what they protected. You stand on ground they held. So let yourself rest now. Let these centuries settle like dust after a long journey. Dream, perhaps, of a city on the water where East met West, where impossible domes floated in the air, where knowledge was preserved through dark ages. Sleep well. And remember Constantinople, the city that refused to fade, the empire history forgot, the light that burned for 1100 years before its final beautiful sunset. Good night.